In the shadows of ancient temples, where mortals prayed for divine protection and mercy, some of the most heinous crimes in history were committed not by monsters lurking in dark caves, but by those who should have cherished their own flesh and blood above all else. 5 figures from mythology crossed the most unthinkable line of human existence. They took the lives of their own children. Some were driven by fear of losing power, others by arrogance so profound it bordered on insanity, one by political necessity that still haunts our understanding of leadership and sacrifice. These are not tales of heroism or divine glory. These are narratives of ancestral horror, where family blood stains sacred altars and golden thrones alike. The third case is so macabre, so utterly beyond comprehension, that it challenges everything we think we know about the capacity for evil. Cronus, the Titan who devoured his legacy. Before Zeus ruled Olympus, before the gods we know walked among mortals, the world belonged to the Titans. These primordial beings were the first generation of divine power, born from Gaia, the earth, and Uranus, the sky. Among them, one stood as king, Cronus, the youngest son of Uranus, whose name would become synonymous with the devouring nature of time itself. His story begins not with the murder of his children, but with the murder of his father's authority. Uranus, the sky god, was a tyrant who feared his own offspring. When Gaia gave birth to the monstrous Cyclopes and the 100-handed Centamenes, Uranus was so disgusted by their appearance that he imprisoned them in the depths of Tartarus, the darkest pit of the underworld. This act of cruelty caused Gaia immense pain, as Tartarus was within her own body. The earth herself cried out for vengeance, and she turned to her children, the Titans, begging them to overthrow their oppressive father. Most of the Titans cowered in fear, unwilling to challenge Uranus's absolute power. But Cronus, the youngest, possessed both the courage and the ambition necessary for patricide. Gaia fashioned for him a great adamantine sickle, a weapon sharp enough to cut through divine flesh. She instructed Cronus to hide and wait for the moment when Uranus descended to lie with Gaia in their cosmic coupling. When that moment came, when Uranus was at his most vulnerable, Cronus struck with brutal efficiency. The sickle flashed in the primordial darkness, and with one terrible stroke, Cronus castrated his father, severing his genitals and casting them into the sea. From the blood that fell upon the earth, the Furies were born. From the genitals that fell into the ocean, mixing with sea foam, Aphrodite herself would eventually emerge. Uranus, wounded and humiliated beyond measure, retreated to the far reaches of the cosmos. His reign ended. Cronus seized the throne and ushered in what would later be called the Golden Age, a time when humans lived without toil or suffering, when the earth gave forth its bounty freely, when death came gently like sleep. Cronus married his sister Rhea, and together they ruled the cosmos from their palace on Mount Othrys. For a time, it seemed that Cronus had broken the cycle of violence and created a new order of peace and prosperity. But power corrupts, and absolute power corrupts absolutely. Cronus, who had overthrown his father, now feared the same fate would befall him. This fear was not mere paranoia. Gaia and Uranus, still bitter over their son's betrayal, whispered a prophecy that would consume Cronus's thoughts day and night. One of his own children would dethrone him, just as he had dethroned Uranus. The cycle of violence was not broken. It was merely waiting to repeat itself. When Rhea became pregnant with their first child, Cronus felt the weight of the prophecy pressing down upon him. He had a choice to make. He could choose to be different from his father, to trust his children, to rule with wisdom and mercy rather than fear. Or he could take preventative action, no matter how monstrous. Cronus chose fear. He chose power. He chose monstrosity. When Hestia was born, when Rhea cut the umbilical cord and held her newborn daughter for the first time, Cronus waited only long enough for the child to draw her first breath. Then, without hesitation, without mercy, without even a flicker of paternal love, he tore the baby from Rhea's arms and swallowed her whole. The infant goddess slid down his throat, alive and screaming, to settle in the eternal darkness of his stomach. Rhea's screams of horror echoed through the palace, But there was no one powerful enough to challenge the king of the Titans. No one would dare. The tragedy repeated itself with systematic precision. Demeter was born next, and she too disappeared into Cronus's gullet moments after her first cry. Then came Hera, the future queen of Olympus, who never had a chance to draw a second breath before her father consumed her. Hades followed, then Poseidon. 5 children, 5 victims of their father's paranoia. Each birth brought hope that perhaps this time would be different, that perhaps Cronus would relent, that perhaps paternal instinct would overcome fear. But each time, Cronus proved that his love of power exceeded any capacity for love of his offspring. What makes this crime particularly horrific is not just the act itself, but the cold calculation behind it. Cronus was not in a state of madness or temporary rage. He didn't kill his children in a moment of passion or under the influence of some external force. Each infanticide was premeditated, planned, executed with the precision of a military strategist. He scheduled these murders in advance, knowing exactly when Rhea would give birth, preparing himself mentally for the act he was about to commit. Moreover, Cronus didn't kill his children to end their suffering or spare them some worse fate. He imprisoned them alive in his stomach, where they would remain conscious but powerless, growing to maturity but trapped in a prison of flesh and digestive acids. The Titans were immortal, which meant these children could not die from lack of air or nourishment. They simply existed in eternal darkness, aware of their confinement, unable to escape, growing stronger with each passing year, but completely impotent. It was not just murder, it was eternal torture. Rhea, driven to the brink of madness by the loss of 5 children, could not bear to see another baby disappear down Cronus's throat. When she felt the 6th pregnancy taking form within her, she knew she had to act. She traveled in secret to the island of Crete, guided by Gaia, her mother, who remembered her own pain when Uranus had imprisoned her children. In a deep cave on Mount Ida, surrounded by nymphs and divine attendants who swore oaths of secrecy, Rhea gave birth to Zeus. The baby boy was immediately taken and hidden in the depths of the cave, where his cries were masked by the Curetes, warrior priests who clashed their spears against their bronze shields, creating a cacophony that drowned out any sound of infantile weeping. The goat Amalthea nursed him with her milk, while bees brought honey from the surrounding forests. Zeus grew strong in secret, raised by nymphs who taught him about the crimes of his father and the siblings trapped within Cronus's belly. Meanwhile, Rhea returned to Mount Othrys, carrying a large stone wrapped tightly in swaddling clothes. She had shaped it carefully to approximate the weight and feel of a newborn baby. With tears streaming down her face, tears that could have been from genuine grief or from the anxiety of her deception, she presented this bundle to Cronus. The king of the Titans, so paranoid about his children, but so confident in his system of infanticide, didn't examine the bundle carefully. He had done this 5 times before. It had become routine. He simply grabbed what he thought was his 6th child and swallowed it without hesitation. The stone settled heavily in his stomach, joining the 5 divine children already imprisoned there. Cronus felt its weight and believed himself safe. 6 children, 6 threats neutralized. The prophecy could not come to pass if all his offspring were trapped inside him. He returned to his throne, to his rule, to his golden age, believing he had outsmarted fate itself. He was wrong. Zeus grew to adulthood in his Cretan sanctuary, becoming strong, wise, and increasingly angry about what had been done to his siblings. When he reached maturity, he emerged from hiding and sought out Metis, the Titaness of wisdom and cunning, who would later become his first wife. Together, they concocted a plan that was as clever as it was dangerous. They would make Cronus vomit up the children he had swallowed, releasing Zeus's siblings so they could fight together against their father. Metis prepared a powerful emetic potion, mixing mustard and wine with various herbs and divine substances designed to cause violent regurgitation even in a Titan's constitution. Zeus, disguising himself as a cupbearer, infiltrated his father's palace during one of the great feasts celebrating the harvest. He waited for the perfect moment, when Cronus was relaxed and drinking heavily, when his guard was down. Then Zeus served the poisoned drink to his father. The effects were immediate and catastrophic. Cronus's eyes widened in shock as his stomach began to convulse. He tried to stand but doubled over, clutching his abdomen. Then came the vomiting. First, the stone emerged, the fake Zeus that Rhea had substituted, which would later be placed at Delphi as a sacred marker. But Cronus kept vomiting, and one by one, the siblings emerged. Poseidon came out first, now fully grown, his eyes blazing with fury and newfound power over the seas. Then Hades, dark and terrible, already manifesting his dominion over the realm of the dead. Hera appeared next, regal and wrathful, followed by Demeter, who brought with her the promise of harvest and famine. Finally, Hestia, the eldest, emerged last, her gentle nature somehow preserved despite years of imprisonment. The 5 siblings stood before their father, no longer helpless infants, but powerful gods in their own right. The imprisonment had not weakened them. If anything, it had concentrated their power, allowing it to mature in the strangest incubator imaginable. They were full-grown, furious, and ready for war. Cronus looked at his 6 children arrayed against him and realized his worst nightmare had come true. The prophecy would be fulfilled not because he failed to prevent it, but because his very attempts to prevent it had created the circumstances for its fulfillment. What followed was the Titanomachy, the great war between the Olympians and the Titans that lasted 10 years and nearly destroyed the cosmos. Zeus freed the Cyclopes and Centimanes from Tartarus, gaining their loyalty and their power. The Cyclopes forged the legendary weapons, thunderbolts for Zeus, a trident for Poseidon, a helm of invisibility for Hades. Armed with these weapons and united in their hatred of Cronus, the 6 siblings fought against the Titans. The war was catastrophic. Mountains were leveled, seas boiled. The very fabric of reality threatened to tear apart. But ultimately, the Olympians prevailed. Cronus and most of the Titans were cast down into Tartarus, that same dark pit where Uranus had once imprisoned his own monstrous children. The irony was perfect. Cronus, who had rebelled against his father's tyranny, became a tyrant himself. Cronus, who had imprisoned his children to prevent his overthrow, was himself overthrown and imprisoned. The cycle of violence had completed itself. In later years, some myths suggest that Zeus eventually released Cronus from Tartarus and made him king of the Elysian fields, where the blessed dead dwelt. If true, this would represent a breaking of the cycle, Zeus choosing mercy over revenge, ending the pattern of violence that had defined the relationship between fathers and sons in the divine realm. But this reconciliation, if it happened at all, came too late to undo the horrors that Cronus had inflicted upon his children. The legacy of Cronus's crimes echoed through Greek mythology. He became the symbol of paranoia and tyranny, of power that consumes everything, including one's own family. The Romans called him Saturn and associated him with time itself, Father Time who devours all his children, all of creation, all of existence. Every second that passes, every moment that dies, became associated with Cronus's insatiable appetite. The golden age that he ushered in was forever tainted by the blood of his actions, a reminder that even the most prosperous times can be built upon foundations of horror. But perhaps the most disturbing aspect of Cronus's story is how it reflects fundamental human fears about power, family, and mortality. Parents are supposed to protect their children, to sacrifice for them, to put their welfare above all else. Cronus inverted this most basic moral principle, sacrificing his children to protect himself, putting his power above their very lives. In doing so, he became not just a monster in myth, but a cautionary tale about what happens when fear overwhelms love, when power corrupts compassion, when the instinct for self-preservation destroys the bonds of family. Now, before we continue to our next horrifying tale, I want to know what you think. Drop the word devoured in the comments if you believe Cronus's crime was the worst in this list. And if you haven't already, hit that subscribe button, because what's coming next will test everything you thought you knew about evil in mythology. Tantalus, the king who cooked his son for the gods. Tantalus was no ordinary mortal. As the son of Zeus and the Oceanid Pluto, he possessed royal blood, both mortal and divine. He ruled the wealthy kingdom of Sipylus in Lydia, where his palace rivaled even those of the gods in splendor and magnificence. But Tantalus's greatest privilege wasn't his kingdom or his wealth. It was his relationship with the Olympian gods. Unlike other mortals who could only worship from afar, Tantalus regularly dined at Zeus's table on Mount Olympus. He sat beside immortals, shared their nectar and ambrosia, listened to their conversations about the governance of the cosmos. He knew their secrets, their plans, their very thoughts. This extraordinary privilege should have made Tantalus the wisest and most grateful of men. Instead, it bred in him a dangerous combination of arrogance and contempt. The more time Tantalus spent with the gods, the less impressed he became by them. He began to see their flaws, their petty jealousies, their mistakes. He started to believe that he, a mere mortal, might actually be their equal, or perhaps even their superior. After all, hadn't he fooled them before? He had stolen nectar and ambrosia from Olympus, that divine food that granted immortality, and shared it with his mortal friends. He had revealed divine secrets to other humans, breaking sacred confidences without consequence. Each transgression made him bolder, more convinced of his own cleverness. But these crimes, serious as they were, paled in comparison to what Tantalus would eventually do. He decided to conduct what he called the ultimate test of divine omniscience. The gods claimed to be all-knowing, to see through any deception, to recognize truth in all its forms. Tantalus would prove whether this was genuine divine wisdom or mere divine arrogance. To conduct this test, he would host a banquet for the gods at his own palace in Sipylus. And he would serve them something no god should ever consume: human flesh. Specifically, the flesh of his own son, Pelops. The choice of victim reveals the depths of Tantalus's depravity. He didn't select a slave or a prisoner or a stranger. He chose Pelops, his own child, a young man beloved by all who knew him. Some sources suggest Pelops was still a boy, perhaps only 8 or 9 years old. Others indicate he was a teenager on the cusp of manhood. But his exact age matters less than the simple fact. This was Tantalus's son, someone he had raised, taught, and supposedly loved. The preparations for the banquet began weeks in advance. Invitations were sent to Olympus, and the gods, honoring their friend Tantalus, agreed to descend for the feast. The palace kitchens bustled with activity as servants prepared countless dishes: roasted meats, fresh breads, exotic fruits, rare wines. Everything had to be perfect for this unprecedented gathering. But Tantalus had reserved one special dish for his own personal preparation, a dish he would allow no servant to see or touch. On the night before the banquet, while the palace slept, Tantalus descended to the royal kitchens. He had dismissed all servants, claiming he wanted to personally prepare a surprise dish for his divine guests. What happened in those midnight hours remains one of mythology's darkest secrets. Tantalus called his son Pelops to the kitchens, perhaps under some pretext of helping with preparations, of learning the skills of hospitality, of participating in this historic event. Then Tantalus murdered his son. Different versions of the myth provide different details, but all agree on the basic horror. Some say he slit Pelops's throat quickly, killing him before the boy could understand what was happening. Others suggest a more brutal method, perhaps striking him unconscious first. But the method of murder was just the beginning of the atrocity. Tantalus then dismembered Pelops's body with the precision of a butcher, separating flesh from bone, cutting the meat into pieces that could be cooked and served. He prepared his son's flesh as a stew, placing the pieces in a large cauldron filled with water, herbs, and spices. The water was brought to a boil, and Pelops's flesh cooked slowly throughout the night, the aroma filling the kitchen. Tantalus tended the pot carefully, tasting and adjusting the seasoning, treating his murdered son's remains as any chef would treat a prize dish. By dawn, the stew was ready, its true contents disguised by herbs and preparation, looking no different from any other meat dish that might grace a royal table. When the gods arrived for the banquet, they were greeted with all the ceremony and respect due to divine visitors. The feast began with traditional courses: cheeses, olives, fresh bread, wine. Conversation flowed easily, with the gods relaxed and enjoying their mortal friends' hospitality. Then came the main courses, dozens of dishes arrayed on tables, servants circulating with platters and bowls. Among these dishes was Tantalus's special stew, the dish he had prepared with his own hands. The gods began to serve themselves, filling their plates with various meats and delicacies. But as the stew was passed around the table, something happened that Tantalus had not anticipated. The gods didn't taste it and pronounce it delicious. They didn't even bring it to their lips. The moment the bowl came near them, every god at the table recoiled in horror and disgust. They knew. Immediately and instinctively, they recognized that the meat before them was human flesh. All of them except one. Demeter, the goddess of the harvest, was lost in grief over the abduction of her daughter Persephone by Hades. Her mind was elsewhere, consumed by worry and sorrow. In her distraction, she absent-mindedly took a piece of the stew and ate it before anyone could stop her. The moment she swallowed, she realized what she had done, and her face transformed from grief to horror. She had just consumed part of Pelops' shoulder. Zeus rose from the table, his face dark with a fury that made Mount Olympus tremble. With one gesture, he overturned the entire banquet table, sending dishes crashing to the floor. The place where this happened would later be called Trapezis, from the Greek word for table, commemorating this moment of divine wrath. The other gods stood, their power crackling in the air, their judgment clear on their faces. "You dare," Zeus thundered, his voice shaking the palace foundations. "You dare to serve us human flesh? To make us complicit in murder and cannibalism? To test us, as if we were your subjects rather than your superiors?" Tantalus tried to speak, to explain his reasoning, to justify his actions. But there could be no justification, no explanation that would excuse what he had done. He had killed his own son. He had butchered the boy's body. He had cooked his flesh and tried to trick the gods into eating it. These were not the actions of a clever man testing divine wisdom. These were the actions of a monster. The gods immediately set about resurrecting Pelops. They gathered the pieces of his body, reconstituting his form with divine power. But the shoulder that Demeter had consumed could not be recovered from her immortal digestive system. Hephaestus, the divine craftsman, forged a replacement shoulder from ivory, perfectly formed and attached to Pelops' body with such skill that it moved and functioned like natural flesh. When Pelops opened his eyes, restored to life, he was more beautiful than ever, his new ivory shoulder actually enhancing his appearance. In fact, he was so beautiful that Poseidon fell in love with him and took him to Olympus to serve as his companion for several years. But the gods' mercy toward Pelops only made their judgment of Tantalus more severe. Zeus personally condemned his son to eternal punishment in Tartarus, that deepest, darkest pit of the underworld reserved for the worst offenders. The punishment was designed to specifically torment Tantalus's appetites and arrogance. Tantalus was placed in a pool of crystal-clear water that came up to his chin. Above him hung branches heavy with luscious fruits, ripe apples, sweet pears, purple grapes, all within apparent reach. The torment was elegant in its simplicity. Whenever Tantalus bent his head to drink from the pool, the water would recede, dropping just beyond his lips. Whenever he reached up to grasp the fruit, the branches would lift away, the food remaining forever just inches beyond his fingertips. This was his eternity. Standing in water he couldn't drink, beneath fruit he couldn't eat, tormented by the very sustenance he craved. Some versions of the myth add that a large boulder hung suspended above Tantalus's head, threatening to fall and crush him at any moment, adding the terror of impending doom to his physical torments. Others say that whenever he tried to rest, vultures would descend to peck at him, or that the water would rise to threaten drowning whenever he stopped standing perfectly still. The punishment gave rise to the English word tantalize, to torment someone by presenting them with something desirable that they cannot have, to offer hope that can never be fulfilled. Every time someone uses this word, they invoke the memory of Tantalus, the king who killed his son to satisfy his arrogant curiosity. But the punishment wasn't limited to Tantalus himself. The crime cursed his entire bloodline, creating what became known as the House of Atreus, one of the most troubled dynasties in all of Greek mythology. Pelops, though resurrected, carried the trauma of his murder and cannibalization. He would go on to father two sons, Atreus and Thyestes, who became locked in a cycle of violence and revenge that echoed their grandfather's crime. Atreus discovered that his brother Thyestes had seduced his wife. In revenge, Atreus killed Thyestes' sons, cooked them in a stew, and served them to their father at a reconciliation banquet. When Thyestes had eaten his fill, Atreus revealed the truth, presenting him with his son's hands and feet. The pattern repeated: murder of children, cooking of flesh, the revelation designed for maximum psychological torment. The curse of cannibalism that Tantalus had initiated continued through generations. Atreus' sons were Agamemnon and Menelaus, the leaders of the Greek forces in the Trojan War. Agamemnon would go on to sacrifice his own daughter Iphigenia, continuing the family tradition of killing children. When he returned from Troy, his wife Clytemnestra murdered him in revenge for Iphigenia's death. Their son Orestes then killed Clytemnestra to avenge his father, and was pursued by the Furies for the crime of matricide. The curse rolled down through the generations like a boulder, crushing each successive family member. What makes Tantalus's crime particularly disturbing is its motivation, or rather, its lack of clear motivation. Cronus devoured his children out of fear of losing power. Lycaon, whom we'll discuss next, at least claimed to be testing Zeus's divinity. But Tantalus killed Pelops, seemingly for no reason beyond intellectual curiosity and arrogant pride. He wanted to prove he was clever enough to fool the gods, to demonstrate his superiority even over immortal beings. That desire, that ego, was apparently worth more to him than his son's life. This raises uncomfortable questions about the nature of evil. Is calculated, purposeless evil somehow worse than evil driven by fear or passion? Tantalus wasn't defending himself or his kingdom. He wasn't driven mad by God's curse. He wasn't following orders or prophecy. He simply decided, in cold rationality, that testing the gods' omniscience was more important than his child's existence. He prioritized his own curiosity over Pelops's right to live. The myth of Tantalus has resonated through Western literature and philosophy for millennia. Dante placed him in his Inferno. Shakespeare referenced him. Modern psychologists use his story to discuss narcissistic personality disorder and the dangers of unchecked ego. The image of the man tormented by unreachable sustenance has become a universal symbol for human desire and frustration. But perhaps the most chilling aspect of Tantalus' story is how it reflects real human capacity for evil. Throughout history, there have been individuals who harmed others not out of desperation or survival or even hatred, but simply to see what would happen, to satisfy curiosity, to prove a point. The scientific experiments conducted on concentration camp prisoners, the torture methods tested on political prisoners, the psychological studies that deliberately traumatized children to study the effects. Tantalus's crime, while mythological, points to a very real human capacity, the ability to value knowledge, pride, or curiosity more than we value human life. As Pelops was restored to life, he bore his ivory shoulder as a permanent reminder of his father's crime. That shoulder, white and gleaming, visible to all who saw him, ensured that no one could ever forget what Tantalus had done. In the same way, the story of Tantalus's banquet remains etched in cultural memory, a permanent reminder that sometimes the real monsters are not the creatures of darkness, but the humans who convince themselves that other humans are merely objects to be used in their experiments and games. Lycaon, the first werewolf's unspeakable crime. The third case in our catalog of horrors takes us to ancient Arcadia, a mountainous region in the heart of Greece known for its wild, untamed nature. Here ruled Lycaon, a king whose name would become synonymous with transformation, savagery, and a crime so disturbing that the chief of the gods himself would be moved to near-apocalyptic wrath. Lycaon's story is the tale of how humanity's first werewolf was created, and the monstrous act that triggered this transformation. Lycaon was no minor king. He was the son of Pelasgus, the first king of Arcadia and founder of the Arcadian people. By all accounts, Lycaon was an effective ruler in many ways. He founded the city of Lycosura, reportedly the oldest city in all of Greece. He established the worship of Zeus Lycaeus on Mount Lycaon, creating temples and instituting the Lycaean Games, athletic competitions that some claimed predated even the famous Olympic Games. He dedicated the first temple to Hermes of Cyllene. In his public role, Lycaon appeared to be a pious king bringing civilization and religious practice to his people. But there was a darker side to Lycaon's reign. Ancient sources describe him as cruel, impious, and paranoid. He had sired 50 sons by various wives, and these sons shared their father's brutal nature. Together, the sons of Lycaon ruled Arcadia with tyrannical authority, each controlling a different town or region, creating a network of corruption and cruelty throughout the land. They were known as the most nefarious and carefree men of their generation, showing contempt for both human law and divine order. The trouble began when disturbing reports reached Mount Olympus about the state of humanity. Zeus heard rumors that humans were becoming increasingly wicked, violent, and impious. The golden age of Cronus was long past, and humans seemed to be degenerating morally with each generation. Zeus, who despite his many personal flaws cared about justice and cosmic order, decided he needed to investigate these claims personally. He couldn't trust second-hand reports. He needed to see with his own eyes whether humanity had truly become as corrupt as the rumor suggested. So Zeus descended from Olympus disguised as a humble peasant, a traveler seeking shelter and hospitality. In the ancient Greek world, hospitality, xenia, was one of the most sacred obligations. A host was required to feed, shelter, and protect a guest, and a guest in turn was required to respect the host's home and not abuse their generosity. This reciprocal relationship was protected by Zeus himself, who bore the epithet Zeus Xenios, Zeus the protector of guests. To violate the laws of hospitality was to invite divine wrath. Zeus's journey took him to Arcadia, and specifically to the palace of King Lycaon. The people of Arcadia recognized the stranger as someone unusual. There was something in his bearing, in his eyes, that suggested divinity, and word quickly spread that a god might be visiting them in disguise. Some citizens began offering prayers and reverence to the mysterious traveler, hoping to gain divine favor. Lycaon heard these rumors and was filled with a mixture of skepticism and anger. He ruled by fear and authority, and he didn't appreciate his subjects showing deference to some random wanderer. Was this stranger truly a god, or was it just another mortal taking advantage of superstitious peasants? Lycaon decided he would find out definitively and dramatically. He would conduct a test that would either prove the stranger was divine or expose him as a fraud. And if the stranger was indeed Zeus, well, Lycaon wanted to demonstrate that even the king of the gods wasn't beyond challenge in his domain. What happened next varies slightly depending on which ancient source you consult, but all versions agree on the essential horror. Lycaon decided to serve his divine guest a meal of human flesh. If the guest was truly a god, truly omniscient and all-knowing, he would recognize what he was being fed and refuse it. If the guest was just a mortal con artist, he would eat it unknowingly and be revealed as a fraud. In Lycaon's twisted logic, this was the perfect test. But Lycaon didn't kill a prisoner or a slave for his gruesome experiment. According to most versions of the myth, he selected his own flesh and blood as the victim. Some sources say it was his youngest son Nyctimus, whose name derives from Nyx, meaning night, suggesting the murder took place under cover of darkness. Other versions claim it was his grandson Arcas, the son of his daughter Callisto, and Zeus himself, making the crime even more direct in its challenge to the god. A few sources suggest it was simply a Molossian prisoner, though this seems less likely given the narrative's emphasis on the horror of the act. For our purposes, let's follow the most commonly cited version. Lycaon murdered his own son Nyctimus. The king took the boy, perhaps under some pretext of a special task or privilege, and killed him in the palace's most secluded chambers. The method of murder is not specified in most sources, but the aftermath is described in gruesome detail. Lycaon personally butchered his son's body, cutting the flesh from the bones with practiced skill. This was not the panicked work of someone caught up in momentary madness. This was deliberate, methodical butchery. Then came the cooking. According to Ovid's account in Metamorphoses, Lycaon cut the throat of a Molossian hostage sent to him, and partly softened his still quivering limbs in boiling water, partly roasted them on fires that burned beneath. Whether the victim was Nyctimus or another, the description is clear. Lycaon didn't simply cook the meat. He divided it, preparing it in different ways, part boiled until tender, part roasted over open flames until the skin crisped and the flesh took on the char and smoke of the cooking fire. The preparation must have taken hours. Boiling meat until it becomes tender requires sustained heat and attention. Roasting over an open fire demands constant vigilance to prevent burning. Throughout this process, Lycaon would have had to touch his son's flesh, turn it, season it, test its readiness. Every moment should have forced him to confront what he was doing, to reconsider, to show some spark of paternal feeling or basic human decency. But Lycaon continued, committed to his test, determined to prove his point regardless of the cost. Some versions add an even more disturbing detail. Lycaon didn't just prepare the flesh for Zeus. He tasted it himself. Before serving it to his guest, he sampled his own creation, taking a bite of his son's cooked meat to ensure it was properly prepared. This detail, if true, makes Lycaon not just a murderer, but a cannibal, someone who crossed not just one taboo, but multiple sacred boundaries simultaneously. When the meal was ready, Lycaon served it to Zeus with all the ceremony of a formal banquet. Plates were arranged, wine was poured. The king personally presented the main course to his honored guest. He watched Zeus carefully, looking for any sign of recognition, any indication that the god knew what he was being offered. This was the moment of truth, the revelation that would prove whether the stranger was truly divine. But Zeus, being omniscient, had known what Lycaon was planning before the king had even finalized his murderous scheme. The god had seen Nyctimus being killed, had watched the butchering and cooking with growing rage, had observed every step of this horrific process while maintaining his disguise. Now, confronted with the final insult of being served human flesh, possibly the flesh of his own grandson, at what should have been a table of hospitality, Zeus's divine fury could no longer be contained. According to Ovid's account, Zeus didn't immediately reveal himself. Instead, he calmly refused the meal. Then, in the middle of the night, while Lycaon slept, Zeus set about his revenge. He brought the entire palace roof down with thunderbolts, destroying the building in fire and lightning. Lycaon woke to flames and collapsing stone, and tried to flee the destruction. He ran out into the night, screaming in terror, his night clothes catching fire, his feet bare on the rough ground. But Zeus's punishment had only begun. As Lycaon ran, his body began to change. His howls of fear transformed into actual howls, the cry of a wolf. Gray fur sprouted across his skin. His arms and legs reformed into 4 canine legs. His face elongated into a muzzle, his teeth sharpening into fangs. His fingernails became claws. Within moments, Lycaon had been transformed from a human king into a wolf. Specifically, the first werewolf, the original lycanthrope, whose name would define the condition of human-to-wolf transformation for all time. But this wasn't a complete transformation that removed Lycaon's human consciousness. Ancient sources emphasize that Lycaon retained his human mind even in wolf form, trapped in an animal body, but aware of his former humanity. He could understand what had happened to him, but couldn't speak, couldn't plead, couldn't beg for mercy. He could only howl in rage and frustration, running on 4 legs across the Arcadian plains, forever exiled from human society, forever marked as a monster. The descriptions of Lycaon's wolf form emphasize that it wasn't just any wolf. Ovid writes, "His vesture separates in shaggy hair, his arms are changed to legs. And as a wolf, he has the same gray locks, the same hard face, the same bright eyes, the same ferocious look." The transformation preserved aspects of Lycaon's human appearance, creating something truly uncanny, a wolf that was unmistakably once human, a monster that bore witness to its own crime through its very existence. But Zeus's wrath extended beyond Lycaon himself. The king's 50 sons, who had participated in various crimes and supported their father's impious rule, were struck down by Zeus's lightning. Only the youngest, Nyctimus, who in this version of the myth had not been the victim, but had been saved by Gaia's intervention, survived to inherit the now ruined kingdom. Some sources suggest that the Great Deluge, the flood of Deucalion that destroyed most of humanity, occurred during Nyctimus's reign as further punishment for the crimes of the Lycaonids. The transformation of Lycaon into a wolf wasn't just personal punishment. It became the foundation of a dark cult practice. On Mount Lycaon, where Lycaon had established the worship of Zeus Lycaeus, Wolf Zeus, secret rituals developed that allegedly involved human sacrifice. According to various ancient sources, including Plato's Republic and the accounts of the geographer Pausanias, these rites occurred every 9 years. The ceremony reportedly worked as follows. A particular clan would gather on the mountain to make a sacrifice to Zeus Lycaeus. They would kill a human victim, often a child or young person, and burn the body as a sacrifice. The flesh would be mixed with the meat of animals, and the mixture would be served to the initiates. Whoever ate the human flesh would be transformed into a wolf for a period of 9 years. If they managed to abstain from eating human flesh during those 9 years, they would return to human form. If they gave in to the wolf's hunger and consumed human meat, they would remain wolves forever. This legendary ritual gave rise to the concept of lycanthropy, the transformation of humans into wolves that would haunt European folklore for centuries. Every werewolf story, every tale of a human cursed to transform under the full moon, every legend of wolfmen hunting in the dark, traces its roots back to Lycaon's crime and punishment on Mount Lycaon. Modern archaeological excavations on Mount Lycaon have yielded disturbing findings. In 2016, archaeologists discovered human skeletal remains at the ancient altar site, including the skeleton of a teenage boy dating back 3,000 years. The bones showed evidence of having been burned and mixed with animal bones, consistent with the ancient accounts of ritual sacrifice. While this doesn't prove the truth of the Lycaon myth specifically, it suggests that some form of human sacrifice did occur at this site, lending credibility to the ancient stories of dark rituals. But beyond the myth and its cultic practices, what does Lycaon's story tell us about the ancient Greek understanding of evil, transformation, and punishment? First, there's the concept of appropriate punishment. That Lycaon's transformation into a wolf wasn't random, but symbolically connected to his crime. He acted like a beast, showing no more moral feeling than a wild animal. So he was transformed into a beast permanently. The Greeks believed that external form should reflect internal character, and Lycaon's wolf body manifested his wolf-like soul. Second, there's the violation of hospitality. In attempting to test Zeus through serving human flesh, Lycaon didn't just commit murder. He weaponized the sacred relationship between host and guest, turning a meal that should have represented trust and community into an instrument of deception and horror. He perverted every value that made human society possible: parental love, hospitality, honesty, respect for both human and divine law. Third, there's the theme of hubris, that dangerous pride that makes mortals think they can challenge the gods. Lycaon's test of Zeus's divinity was fundamentally an assertion of his own importance. He was saying, in effect, I am significant enough that the gods must prove themselves to me. This arrogance, combined with his willingness to murder his own child to prove a point, represents the intersection of pride and monstrosity that the Greeks found particularly reprehensible. The enduring power of Lycaon's story lies in how it combines multiple horrors into a single narrative: infanticide, cannibalism, sacrilege, and transformation. Each element amplifies the others. He didn't just kill his son, he cooked him. He didn't just cook him, he served him to a god. He didn't just serve him to a god, he intended it as a test and a challenge. Every layer adds another dimension of transgression, and the punishment fits perfectly. Lycaon wanted to test whether divine beings were truly different from mortals. His punishment demonstrated that they absolutely were. Zeus could transform the king's very nature, could strip away his humanity and leave him trapped between human consciousness and animal form, could create a new type of monster as a warning to all future generations. The message was clear: the gods are real, they are powerful, and they will punish those who challenge them, especially through crimes against their own children. In the end, Lycaon's story serves as the mythological origin point for one of humanity's most enduring monster figures, the werewolf, the man-beast, the human who loses their humanity and becomes something savage and terrible. Every time a werewolf appears in literature, film, or folklore, it carries the genetic memory of Lycaon's crime. The act so horrific that it created an entirely new category of monster, a punishment so severe that it reshaped human flesh into animal form, a transformation so complete that the only thing that remained was the knowledge of what had been lost. And perhaps that's the most terrible punishment of all. Not death, not physical pain, but the eternal knowledge of your own monstrosity, the inability to return to what you once were, the permanent exile from humanity caused by your own violation of humanity's most basic values. We're at the halfway point of these horrifying tales, and I need to know, are you still with me? Drop a comment with the word wolf if Lycaon's transformation shocked you. And make sure you're subscribed, because the next two stories will push the boundaries even further. Heracles, when the greatest hero became the darkest killer. Our fourth tale forces us to confront an uncomfortable truth. Sometimes the most horrific crimes are committed not by villains or monsters, but by heroes driven to madness. Heracles, called Hercules by the Romans, was the greatest hero of ancient Greece, a demigod whose strength and courage were legendary throughout the ancient world. His 12 labors remain some of mythology's most famous adventures. Yet this same hero, this paragon of masculine virtue and heroic achievement, committed a crime so terrible that it destroyed his own family and nearly destroyed him. Unlike our previous tales of calculated murder, Heracles' crime was involuntary, which in some ways makes it even more tragic. To understand what Heracles did, we must first understand who he was and why the queen of the gods hated him so completely. Heracles was born Alcides to Alcmene, a mortal woman of exceptional virtue and beauty, and Zeus, who had disguised himself as Alcmene's husband Amphitryon to seduce her. When Hera, Zeus's wife, discovered yet another product of her husband's infidelity, her rage was apocalyptic. She had endured countless affairs, but each new bastard child was a fresh humiliation, a living reminder that Zeus valued his pleasures more than his marriage vows. Hera's hatred began before Heracles was even born. She sent Eileithyia, the goddess of childbirth, to delay Alcmene's labor by sitting outside the birthing chamber with crossed fingers and legs, a sympathetic magic that prevented the birth from proceeding. Alcmene labored in agony for days, close to death, until her nurse Galanthus tricked Eileithyia by shouting that the baby had already been born. The confused goddess uncrossed her limbs, breaking the spell and allowing the twins, Heracles and his mortal twin brother Iphicles, to finally emerge. For her deception, Galanthus was transformed into a weasel, the first of many casualties in Hera's war against Heracles. Even as an infant, Heracles demonstrated his extraordinary nature. When he was just 8 months old, Hera sent 2 enormous serpents to kill both babies as they slept in their crib. Iphicles screamed in terror, but Heracles grabbed the snakes, one in each hand, and strangled them with his infant grip. The strangled serpents confirmed what the family had suspected. Heracles was Zeus's son, marked for an extraordinary destiny. That destiny included suffering. As Heracles grew, Hera's persecution continued. He received the finest education, taught music by Linus, archery by Apollo himself, wrestling by Autolycus, how to drive chariots by Amphitryon. But his temper was as legendary as his strength. When Linus reprimanded him too harshly during a music lesson, young Heracles grabbed his lyre and smashed it over his teacher's head, killing him instantly. Even then, the seeds of uncontrollable rage were present. Despite this incident, Heracles matured into exactly the hero he was destined to become. He married Megara, daughter of King Creon of Thebes, and together they had children, Different sources claim anywhere from 3 to 8 sons, though most commonly 3 are named: Therymachus, Dacun, and Creontiades. Some accounts add others to the list. Heracles built a home in Thebes with his own hands, a house that rang with children's laughter and represented everything he had fought to achieve: a normal life, a family, peace. The domesticity suited him. After years of adventures and battles, Heracles discovered he enjoyed being a husband and father. He taught his sons to wrestle, told them stories of his adventures, played simple games with them in the courtyard. Megara was a devoted wife who managed to temper some of his rougher edges. For a brief, shining moment, Heracles was more than a hero. He was a happy man. But Hera had not forgotten or forgiven. She watched his happiness with growing resentment. How dare he be content? How dare Zeus's bastard build a family and live in peace while she suffered the indignity of his very existence? The queen of the gods decided it was time to destroy not just Heracles, but everything he loved. And she knew exactly how to do it. Hera enlisted the help of 2 divine entities: Lyssa, the goddess of mad rage, and Iris, the rainbow messenger. Lyssa was the personification of rabid frenzy, the force that drove men and beasts to uncontrollable violence. She was reluctant to attack Heracles, recognizing his essential goodness and the cruelty of what Hera was asking. But Hera was queen of the gods, and her command was absolute. On a peaceful evening in Thebes, as Heracles returned home from completing his labors, tired but satisfied, looking forward to embracing his wife and children, Lyssa and Iris descended upon him. The madness struck without warning, like a lightning bolt to the brain. One moment Heracles was approaching his house, already smiling at the thought of seeing his family. The next moment, reality fractured and reformed into something unrecognizable. His vision clouded and cleared to reveal not his home in Thebes, but the palace of Eurystheus in Tiryns, the king who had sent him on his labors, the cousin who had humiliated him, the man he secretly hated. The transformation in his mind was total and seamless. Every detail of his actual surroundings was reinterpreted to fit his delusional understanding. In his altered perception, Megara was not his beloved wife, but the queen of Tiryns, wife of his hated enemy. His 3 young sons were not his children, but young soldiers defending Eurystheus, armed and dangerous. The house he had built with his own hands was now enemy territory, every room a battlefield where threats lurked. Even his own father Amphitryon, who was present in the house, appeared to Heracles as Eurystheus himself. What happened next was inevitable and horrifying. Believing himself under attack in enemy territory, Heracles responded as he had been trained, with overwhelming force. He retrieved his weapons, the bow and arrows he had received as gifts from Apollo, arrows tipped with the Lernaean Hydra's blood, a poison so deadly that even a scratch was invariably fatal. He also took up his famous olive wood club, the weapon he had wielded in countless battles against monstrous foes. The first to die was his eldest son, Therymachus. The boy, perhaps 6 or 7 years old, was playing in the courtyard when his father suddenly appeared, bow drawn. In Heracles' mad vision, he saw a young soldier carrying a sword, advancing toward him with hostile intent. He released the arrow without hesitation. The Hydra poison ensured death within seconds, before the child could even process what was happening. Before his scream could fully leave his lips, he was gone. The other children, hearing commotion, came to investigate. Heracles, methodically clearing what he believed was a hostile palace, hunted them room by room. Dacun tried to hide, perhaps in a storage chest or behind a large piece of furniture. But Heracles' senses, superhuman even when mad, detected the child's rapid breathing and terrified heartbeat. He dragged the boy out, seeing not his own son, but an enemy ambusher, and brought his club down with the same force he had used to kill the Nemean lion. The child's skull shattered instantly. The third son, Creontiades, the youngest, ran to his mother. Megara had realized by now that something was terribly wrong with her husband. The man she loved had become something unrecognizable, moving through their home like a killer, speaking words that made no sense. When their youngest son ran to her, she instinctively tried to protect him, wrapping her arms around the boy and placing her own body between him and the approaching figure of her husband. Heracles, in his delusion, saw the queen of Tyrants shielding one final soldier. He drew his bow, aimed carefully despite the close proximity, and released. The arrow punched through Megra's back, through her body, and into the child she was holding. Mother and son fell together, the arrow pinning them in their final embrace. Megra's last conscious thought was probably confusion. Why was the man she loved doing this? Amphitryon, witnessing this massacre, threw himself between Heracles and the rest of the household. The old man, though he had trained Heracles in warfare, was now in his 60s and no match for his supernaturally strong son. But he tried anyway, shouting Heracles' name over and over, trying to penetrate the madness, hoping some spark of recognition would break through the divine frenzy. It almost worked. For just a moment, Heracles hesitated, some part of his true mind pushing against the delusion. But in his twisted perception, he saw only Eurystheus himself, the final enemy, the source of all his troubles. He raised his club for what would have been a killing blow. If that club had fallen, Heracles would have committed patricide in addition to his other crimes. But Athena, who had always been a friend to Heracles, intervened at the last possible second. She materialized in the room and hurled a stone. Some sources say it was a piece of marble from the courtyard, others a special rock kept for this purpose, directly at Heracles' chest. The impact was tremendous, backed by divine strength. It struck with enough force to knock even Heracles unconscious, dropping him to the floor mid-swing. The madness evaporated the moment he fell unconscious. When Lyssa's grip released, when Iris's spell ended, Heracles' mind returned to its natural state. But the physical scene remained unchanged. The three small bodies lay where they had fallen. Megara was slumped against a wall, the arrow still protruding from her back. Blood pooled on the floors of the house Heracles had built. The weapons that had slain monsters now dripped with the blood of innocence. Amphitryon and the servants, terrified and traumatized, bound Heracles to a pillar while he was still unconscious, uncertain what state he would be in when he woke. They tied him tightly with ropes that would have restrained any mortal man, but were pitifully inadequate for someone of Heracles' strength. If he woke still mad, these bonds would snap like thread. But they did what they could, then sat and waited and wept. When Heracles regained consciousness, his first sensations were confusion and pain. His chest hurt where the stone had struck him. His arms and legs felt restrained. His throat was raw, though he didn't remember screaming. His hands were wet with something sticky. He blinked, trying to understand where he was and what had happened. Why was he tied to a pillar? Why was his father sitting on the stairs, looking like he'd aged a decade? Why did the house smell of blood? Father. Heracles' voice was hoarse, uncertain. Why am I bound? What happened? Amphitryon couldn't speak at first. How do you tell a man that he murdered his own family? How do you find the words? Finally, the old man simply pointed toward the courtyard where the bodies had been laid out side by side. Heracles turned his head and saw them. Three small forms, still. A larger form beside them. An arrow still visible. Blood everywhere. His bow lying nearby. Several arrows missing from his quiver. His club stained with something dark and wet. What happened here? The question was automatic, his brain still trying to process the scene, to find an explanation that made sense. Who did this? Who attacked my family while I was... But even as he asked, he noticed his own hands, covered in blood. His own clothes, spattered and soaked. His own weapons, the instruments of death. You did, Amphitryon said, his voice breaking. You killed them. You killed Megara. You killed your sons. All three. You went mad and you killed them. The words didn't compute at first. Couldn't compute. Heracles, the hero, the protector, the father. He would never harm his family. He would die before letting anyone hurt them. There had to be a mistake, a misunderstanding. Someone else had done this, and Amphitryon was confused, traumatized, not thinking clearly. But as the memories came flooding back, distorted, fragmented, but undeniable, Heracles realized the truth. He remembered hunting through the palace of Eurystheus. He remembered killing soldiers. He remembered shooting the queen and her protected warrior. Except it hadn't been Eurystheus' palace. It had been his own home. The soldiers had been his sons. The queen had been Megara. The realization broke something fundamental in Heracles' psyche. A sound emerged from his throat that was barely human, an agonized roar of grief, rage, and horror that shattered pottery and made the very walls of the house tremble. He strained against his bonds, not to attack anyone, but simply to reach his family, to touch them, to confirm what his mind was telling him couldn't possibly be true. "Cut these ropes," he commanded, but Amphitryon hesitated. "Cut them." Heracles roared. "I need to. I have to." "What? Hold them? Apologize to corpses? Take back arrows that had already killed?" There was nothing to be done, no action that could possibly address what had happened. When Amphitryon finally cut the ropes, Heracles immediately tried to go to the bodies. But his father blocked him. "Don't," the old man said. "Don't touch them. You've done enough." The words, though spoken from grief and shock rather than cruelty, cut Heracles more deeply than any weapon. He had done enough. More than enough. Too much. "I have to." Heracles tried again, but couldn't finish the sentence. What did he have to do? The only thing he needed, was impossible. He couldn't unmurder his family, couldn't unkill his sons, couldn't take back the arrows or the club strikes, couldn't restore the life he had built. "It was Hera," Amphitryon finally said. "Servants saw goddesses descending, saw them touch your head. You didn't know what you were doing. You were mad." "It was my hand," Heracles replied. "My bow, my arrows, my strength. The madness came from Hera, but the deaths came from me." This distinction between the source of the madness and the responsibility for the actions would plague Heracles for the rest of his life. Could he be held accountable for actions committed while insane? The gods said yes. The law said yes. His own conscience said yes. In the immediate aftermath, the law was clear. Heracles had committed murder, and it didn't matter that he'd been mad when he did it. He was exiled from Thebes, forbidden to enter the city limits. He couldn't even attend the funeral of his own family, instead forced to watch from a distant hill as small pyres burned, as his sons and wife were consigned to fire and memory. The community that had celebrated his victories now shunned him as a murderer and a monster. Theseus, the great hero of Athens and Heracles' closest friend, came to Thebes when he heard what had happened. Despite warnings about miasma, the ritual pollution that attached to murderers, Theseus approached Heracles and offered sanctuary in Athens. "Come with me," Theseus said. "In Athens you can be purified. You can begin again." But Heracles saw no path forward. "How can I be purified of this?" he asked. "How can any ritual wash away what I've done? How can I look at myself in a mirror? How can I exist knowing what I am?" "You are Heracles," Theseus replied. "The man who saved our world from monsters, who completed impossible labors, who has always fought for what's right. What happened was not your fault." "My hands held the weapons," Heracles countered. "My strength killed them. Fault is irrelevant. I killed my family. That's what I am now. Not a hero. A killer of children." In some versions of the myth, this is when Heracles seriously contemplated suicide. He saw it as the only possible atonement, the only way to balance the scales. How could he continue to exist in a world where his wife and children didn't? How could he draw breath they could no longer draw, eat food they could no longer taste, see sunsets they could no longer see? His continued existence was an insult to their memory. But Theseus argued against this escape. "You don't have the right to choose the easy path," he said, echoing what Amphitryon had said earlier. "You caused this pain. Now you must live with it. Dying would be mercy, and you don't deserve mercy. You deserve to carry this weight every day for the rest of your life." So Heracles went to Delphi to consult the oracle. The Pythia, speaking for Apollo, pronounced the god's judgment. Heracles must serve his cousin Eurystheus, king of Mycenae, for 12 years. He must perform whatever labors Eurystheus assigned, no matter how dangerous or degrading. If he completed these labors, he would be purified of his crimes and granted immortality. The famous 12 labors of Heracles, killing the Nemean lion, destroying the Lernaean hydra, capturing the Erymanthian boar, cleaning the Augean stables, driving away the Stymphalian birds, capturing the Cretan bull, stealing the mares of Diomedes, obtaining the girdle of Hippolyta, stealing the cattle of Geryon, fetching the apples of the Hesperides, and capturing Cerberus, were not originally meant as adventures or heroic quests. They were penance. They were punishment. Each impossible task was designed by Eurystheus to kill Heracles, and each one that Heracles survived only added to his burden of guilt. How could he be alive, successfully completing these labors, when his children were dead? Throughout these labors, Heracles was haunted by memories of what he had done. He would wake in the night seeing his sons' faces. He would complete a task and think about telling Megara before remembering she was gone. He would demonstrate his strength and remember using that same strength to kill. The madness had lasted perhaps an hour. The guilt would last forever. The tragedy of Heracles is different from our other tales. Cronus, Tantalus, Lycaon, they chose their crimes. They made conscious decisions to kill their children for power, pride, or perverse curiosity. Their evil was intentional, calculated, willful. But Heracles loved his family. He would have died to protect them. The crime he committed was exactly the opposite of everything he valued and believed. He became, against his will and without his knowledge, the thing he most hated, a threat to his own family. This raises profound questions about responsibility, guilt, and redemption. If you commit a terrible act while genuinely insane, unable to distinguish right from wrong or reality from delusion, are you morally responsible? Modern law recognizes the insanity defense, but the Greeks were less forgiving. They believed that actions had consequences regardless of intent, that pollution from murder contaminated the killer even if the killer wasn't consciously choosing to kill. Heracles internalized this judgment. He could have claimed victim status, could have blamed Hera entirely, could have excused himself by pointing to the divine madness that gripped him. Instead, he accepted full responsibility. "My hands did this," he repeated throughout his life. He performed the labors not because he hoped they would truly cleanse him, he didn't believe anything could, but because it was what he deserved. Suffering was appropriate. Danger was appropriate. The possibility of death in each labor was appropriate. Years later, after completing his labors and having many other adventures, Heracles died and was admitted to Olympus as a god. In that final transformation, Hera finally relented and made peace with him, even giving him her daughter Hebe as a wife. But even divine apotheosis couldn't erase what had happened. Even as an immortal god, even married to youth itself, Heracles remained the hero who killed his family. That story, that crime, that tragedy would forever be part of his legend. The lesson of Heracles is perhaps the most disturbing of all our tales. The other gods and kings in this list were monsters who did monstrous things. But Heracles was good, genuinely, undeniably good, and still became a killer of his own children. His story suggests that evil doesn't always come from evil people. Sometimes it comes from outside, strikes without warning, turns the best of us into the worst of us. Sometimes the monster isn't something we choose to become. It's something we're forced to become against our very nature. And sometimes no amount of heroism, no number of good deeds, no divine intervention can undo what was done in a single hour of madness. That, perhaps, is the most frightening truth of all. Agamemnon, the sacrifice that doomed a dynasty. Our final tale takes us to the beaches of Aulis, where 1,000 ships sat ready to launch the most famous military campaign in ancient history. Here, in this moment of supposed glory and martial pride, a father made a choice that would define not just his own fate, but the destiny of his entire family line. Agamemnon, the mighty king of Mycenae and commander of the Greek forces, faced an impossible dilemma, and his solution was to sacrifice his own daughter on an altar to appease an angry goddess. Of all our stories, this one might be the most morally complex, because unlike the others, Agamemnon's crime was committed not in madness or arrogance or paranoia, but in cold political calculation. To understand Agamemnon's crime, we must understand the man and his family. Agamemnon was descended from the cursed house of Atreus, itself descended from Pelops, the son whom Tantalus murdered and served the gods, and ultimately from Tantalus himself. The family was wealthy, powerful, and absolutely plagued by inherited violence. Agamemnon's grandfather Atreus had served his brother Thyestes a meal of his own children, continuing the family tradition of using offspring as weapons in adult conflicts. Agamemnon's father Atreus had been killed by Aegisthus, the son of Thyestes, in yet another cycle of familial revenge. Despite this poison heritage, Agamemnon rose to become one of the most powerful kings in Greece. He ruled Mycenae, that mighty fortress city whose walls were so massive that later Greeks believed only Cyclopes could have built them. He married Clytemnestra, who was herself royalty, the daughter of King Tyndareus of Sparta and sister to the beautiful Helen. Together Agamemnon and Clytemnestra had 4 children, 3 daughters named Iphigenia, Chrysothemis, and Electra, and a son named Orestes. The family seemed to have broken the curse, to have achieved something resembling normal royal happiness. Agamemnon was a successful ruler, respected by his people and feared by his enemies. Clytemnestra was an effective queen, managing the palace and raising their children with competence and care. The daughters grew up healthy and beautiful. Young Orestes showed promise as a future warrior and king. For once, the house of Atreus appeared to be functioning like an actual family rather than a horror show. Then Helen, Clytemnestra's sister and wife of Agamemnon's brother Menelaus, was abducted by Paris, prince of Troy. Depending on which version you believe, she was either kidnapped against her will or eloped willingly, but the result was the same. A Spartan queen was now in Troy, and Greek honor demanded her return. Menelaus called upon all the Greek kings who had sworn an oath to defend his marriage, and they answered the call. It would be the largest military expedition Greece had ever mounted. Agamemnon, as the most powerful king and Menelaus's brother, was chosen as the supreme commander of the Greek forces. He took this responsibility seriously, organizing the gathering of troops, ships, and supplies from across Greece. The rendezvous point was Aulis, a port on the coast of Boeotia, from which the combined fleet would sail across the Aegean to Troy. One by one, the contingents arrived. Achilles with his Myrmidons, Ajax with his warriors from Salamis, Odysseus from Ithaca, Diomedes from Argos, and dozens of other heroes, each leading their own forces. It was said that 1,000 ships eventually assembled at Aulis, carrying tens of thousands of soldiers. The Greeks were confident. With such an army, Troy would surely fall quickly. But as weeks passed, the fleet couldn't sail. The winds that should have filled their sails and carried them eastward simply died. Day after day, the sea remained eerily calm, the air still and oppressive. The ships sat motionless in the harbor, while soldiers grew restless, supplies began to run low, and tensions rose. Small skirmishes broke out between different contingents. Men started to question whether the expedition was cursed. Some began packing to return home. The entire campaign was on the verge of collapsing before it had even begun. Calchas, the seer who accompanied the Greek forces, was consulted. After performing various divinations and sacrifices, he announced the cause of their troubles. The goddess Artemis was angry with Agamemnon personally. The exact reason for her anger varied in different tellings. Some sources say Agamemnon had hunted in a grove sacred to Artemis and killed one of her sacred deer. Others claim he boasted that he was a better hunter than the goddess herself, an act of hubris that directly insulted her authority in her own domain. Either way, Artemis had taken offense and was now holding the winds hostage. But Calchas didn't just identify the problem. He also announced the solution. To appease Artemis and restore the winds, Agamemnon must perform a human sacrifice. Specifically, he must sacrifice his eldest daughter, Iphigenia, on an altar to Artemis. Only the blood of Agamemnon's own child would satisfy the goddess's anger and allow the fleet to sail to Troy. The demand was monstrous, unthinkable. Agamemnon's initial response was immediate and definitive. Absolutely not. He would not kill his daughter. He didn't care about the winds or the war or Greek honor. Iphigenia was his child, and no military campaign was worth her life. He would go home to Mycenae, return to his family, and let someone else lead the expedition if they wanted it so badly. But the other kings wouldn't accept this. Menelaus argued most forcefully. This was his wife who had been taken, his marriage that had been insulted, his honor that demanded satisfaction. Odysseus, ever the pragmatist, pointed out the political realities. Thousands of soldiers had left their homes and families based on oaths and promises. If they returned without even attempting to reach Troy, the consequences would be catastrophic. The oaths that bound Greek civilization together would be meaningless. Every king would be weakened, every alliance questioned. More ominously, the soldiers themselves were growing restless and angry. They had been promised glory, plunder, revenge on Troy. Now they were stuck in Aulis, eating through their supplies, getting nothing. If Agamemnon refused to do what was necessary to get them to Troy, they might turn on him. Mutiny was a real possibility. The murder of a commander by his own troops was not unheard of. Agamemnon might lose not just his command, but his life, and possibly the lives of his entire family, as angry soldiers sought revenge for wasted time and broken promises. For days, perhaps weeks, Agamemnon agonized over the decision. He was trapped between two terrible choices: sacrifice his daughter or abandon everything he had worked to build, possibly dying in the process. He couldn't sleep. He couldn't eat. The weight of command, of leadership, of responsibility to the army pressed down upon him. And slowly, terribly, he began to convince himself that there was only one rational choice. This is where Agamemnon's crime becomes particularly disturbing. Unlike our previous examples, he wasn't insane, wasn't testing anyone, wasn't paranoid about prophecies. He was making a calculated political decision. He was choosing, with full knowledge and clear mind, to kill his daughter because it was politically and militarily expedient. He was putting the needs of the state above the life of his child. He was, in his own twisted logic, being a good king by being a terrible father. Having made his decision, Agamemnon faced a new problem: how to get Iphigenia to Aulis. She was back in Mycenae with her mother, safe and ignorant of what was being planned. Clytemnestra would never willingly send her daughter to be sacrificed. Agamemnon needed a deception, a lie that would bring both Iphigenia and Clytemnestra to the military camp without arousing suspicion. So Agamemnon sent messengers to Mycenae with a letter for Clytemnestra. The letter announced wonderful news. The great hero Achilles, the most famous warrior in all of Greece, had asked for Iphigenia's hand in marriage. Achilles wished to marry her before departing for Troy, wanting to bind himself to Agamemnon's family through this noble alliance. It was an enormous honor, the kind of match any parent would celebrate. The wedding would take place at Aulis before the fleet departed, and Clytemnestra should bring Iphigenia immediately so the ceremony could proceed. It was a perfect lie. Clytemnestra had no reason to doubt it. Royal marriages were often arranged quickly for political or military reasons. Achilles was an appropriate match for a princess, young, heroic, destined for glory. The timing made sense if he wanted to marry before potentially dying in battle. Every detail of the story was plausible. Clytemnestra's only thought was joy for her daughter's good fortune. She immediately began preparations. Iphigenia was dressed in her finest clothes, adorned with jewelry befitting a royal bride. Wedding gifts were selected and packed. Clytemnestra gathered appropriate attendants and arranged transportation. The young girl, probably only 13 or 14 years old, was giddy with excitement. She was going to marry Achilles, the greatest warrior of the age. She would be the envy of every young woman in Greece. The journey from Mycenae to Aulis took several days. During that time, Iphigenia chattered constantly about her future husband, about the wedding ceremony, about what their children might be like. Clytemnestra listened with a mother's mixture of happiness and melancholy, pleased for her daughter's bright future, but sad that her little girl was growing up. Neither suspected the horror awaiting them. When they arrived at the military camp at Aulis, something felt wrong immediately. Clytemnestra expected to see wedding preparations, decorations, feast preparations, gathered dignitaries. Instead, she found a military encampment, tense and crowded, with no signs of celebration. When she asked to see Achilles, to meet her future son-in-law, servants made excuses about his being busy with military preparations. When she finally tracked down Agamemnon, her husband couldn't meet her eyes. The truth came out in fragments, pieced together from nervous servants and uncomfortable soldiers. There would be no wedding. Achilles hadn't asked for Iphigenia's hand. In fact, he knew nothing about the supposed engagement. The trip to Aulis had been a trap, a deception to bring the sacrificed victim to the altar. Agamemnon had lied to his wife and daughter, had used the promise of marriage as bait, had betrayed their trust in the most complete way possible. Clytemnestra's rage was apocalyptic. She confronted Agamemnon in front of his officers, screaming her fury and disbelief. "You would murder your own daughter? You would kill the child I bore, the girl I raised, for winds? For a military campaign? For your brother's pride?" She tried to leave, to take Iphigenia and flee the camp, to return to Mycenae, where her daughter would be safe. But Agamemnon's guards stopped her. The decision had been made. The sacrifice would proceed. Achilles, learning that his name had been used in this deception, was furious. His honor had been impugned, his reputation used to facilitate a murder. He confronted Agamemnon and offered to protect Iphigenia with his life. The young warrior, perhaps no more than 20 years old himself, stood before the commander of all Greek forces and declared that the sacrifice would not happen, that he would fight the entire army if necessary to prevent it. But the army had other ideas. Word had spread through the camp about what Calchas had prophesied. The soldiers, desperate to sail to Troy and begin their campaign, supported the sacrifice. They surrounded Achilles, making clear that if he tried to protect Iphigenia, they would kill him first, then take her anyway. Even Achilles, great as he was, couldn't fight thousands of armed men. He was forced to stand aside, helpless to prevent what was coming. In some versions of the story, Iphigenia learned what was planned and tried to run. She was hunted through the camp like an animal, caught by soldiers, dragged screaming to the altar. In other versions, more tragic in their way, Iphigenia went willingly. Upon learning the truth, she made a choice to accept her fate with dignity. She reasoned that if her death was necessary for the Greek cause, if thousands of soldiers needed her sacrifice to fulfill their oaths and achieve glory, then she would die as a hero rather than a victim. She walked to the altar with her head high, speaking words of courage even as tears streamed down her face. "I give my body freely for Greece," she said in Euripides' version. "If this is what the gods demand, who am I to refuse? Lead me to the altar. Sacrifice me, if that is fate's will." Whether these words represented genuine heroism or a young girl trying desperately to find meaning in her senseless death, we'll never know. But they allowed the Greek commanders to tell themselves a comforting lie, that Iphigenia died willingly, nobly, making her murder slightly less unbearable. The altar was prepared on the beach, with all the Greek forces assembled as witnesses. It had to be public, had to be witnessed, so that everyone would know the gods had been satisfied. Iphigenia was led forward, dressed now not in wedding clothes, but in sacrificial garments. The altar itself was traditional, a large flat stone where animal sacrifices were normally performed, now prepared to receive human blood. Who held the knife? In most versions, it was Calchas himself, the seer who had pronounced the necessity of the sacrifice. As the one who had brought the gods' message, he took responsibility for carrying it out. But some versions suggest Agamemnon himself performed the deed, reasoning that if he was willing to order his daughter's death, he should at least have the courage to carry it out personally. Iphigenia was placed on the altar. She might have been bound to prevent struggling, or she might have lain there willingly, maintaining her composure to the end. Prayers were spoken, invoking Artemis and asking her to accept the sacrifice and restore the winds. Then the knife descended. Different versions of the myth diverge dramatically at this point. In the older, darker versions, the sacrifice was completed. The knife cut Iphigenia's throat, Her blood poured onto the altar stone and soaked into the beach sand, and she died there in front of the assembled Greek army. Her last sight would have been the faces of thousands of soldiers watching her die. Her last sound the prayers and chants invoking the goddess who demanded her life. But in later versions, particularly those recorded by Euripides, Artemis intervened at the last possible moment. Just as the knife was about to strike, the goddess appeared in a flash of divine light and substituted a deer for Iphigenia. The knife came down on the deer instead, and Iphigenia vanished, spirited away by Artemis to the distant land of the Taurians in Crimea, where she would serve as a priestess in Artemis's temple. The watching Greeks saw the deer's blood rather than Iphigenia's, and believed the sacrifice had been completed. This more merciful version allowed later Greeks to feel better about the story. It suggested that the gods weren't truly monsters demanding child sacrifice, that there were limits to divine cruelty, that Iphigenia lived and served a higher purpose. But whether she died or was saved at the last moment, the essential crime remained unchanged. Agamemnon was willing to kill his daughter. He performed all the actions necessary for murder. The fact that a god might have intervened didn't erase his intention or his betrayal. Immediately after the sacrifice, whether it was completed or substituted, the winds began to blow. The dead calm that had held the fleet prisoner vanished, replaced by strong winds from the west that would carry the ships to Troy. The soldiers cheered. The commanders ordered embarkation. Within hours, the 1,000 ships were sailing east, beginning the war that would last 10 years and provide material for some of the greatest stories in Western literature. But Agamemnon's family was shattered beyond repair. Clytemnestra, whether her daughter was dead or spirited away, knew that her husband had been willing to kill their child. She knew he had lied to them both, had used the promise of marriage as bait for murder, had chosen military glory over family. That knowledge changed her completely. The woman who had been a loyal wife and effective queen became consumed by hatred and a desire for revenge. For 10 years, while Agamemnon fought at Troy, Clytemnestra plotted. She took Aegisthus as a lover, the son of Thyestes, the man whose children Agamemnon's father had served to him in a stew. Together, they waited for Agamemnon's return, preparing an appropriate welcome for the man who had murdered his daughter. When Agamemnon finally returned to Mycenae, victorious and laden with spoils from Troy's fall, Clytemnestra greeted him with false warmth. She prepared a bath for him, a seemingly loving gesture for a weary warrior. When Agamemnon was in the bath, vulnerable and unarmed, Clytemnestra and Aegisthus struck. She threw a net over him. Some sources describe it as purple robes that tangled his arms, and while he struggled helplessly, unable to reach for weapons or defend himself, they hacked him to death with axes. This, Clytemnestra reportedly said as she struck, is for Iphigenia. Each blow was revenge for her daughter, vengeance for the betrayal at Aulis, justice for a mother's broken heart. She showed Agamemnon no more mercy than he had shown their daughter. She didn't care that he had won the Trojan War, that he was bringing treasure and glory home to Mycenae. All that mattered was that he had been willing to kill their child. But the curse of the house of Atreus didn't end there. Agamemnon's daughter Electra and his son Orestes, now grown, felt duty-bound to avenge their father's murder. Orestes, encouraged by Electra and commanded by Apollo himself, killed both Clytemnestra and Aegisthus. The son became a matricide, killing his own mother to avenge his father, who had killed his sister to appease a goddess, who was angry because of an insult, continuing a chain of violence that stretched back generations to Tantalus and beyond. Orestes was then pursued by the Furies, ancient goddesses of vengeance, who drove matricides mad. He was put on trial in Athens, with the gods themselves serving as jury. Apollo defended him, arguing he was justified in avenging his father. The Furies prosecuted, arguing that killing one's mother was the ultimate crime. The trial ended in a tie, and Athena cast the deciding vote in favor of Orestes, finally breaking the curse of the house of Atreus, but only after generations of murder had carved a path of destruction through the family. Agamemnon's crime is perhaps the most morally complex of our 5 tales. Unlike Cronus, who acted from paranoid self-preservation, or Tantalus and Lycaon, who acted from arrogant pride, or even Heracles, who acted in madness beyond his control, Agamemnon made a rational choice. He weighed his options, considered the consequences, and decided that sacrificing his daughter was the lesser evil compared to abandoning the expedition and possibly dying at the hands of his own troops. This makes his crime both more understandable and more chilling. We can comprehend the pressure he was under, the impossible position he faced. But we can also see the fundamental moral wrought in his reasoning. He convinced himself that political expediency justified killing his child. He told himself he was being a good leader by being a terrible father. He prioritized the opinions of his soldiers, the honor of Greece, and his own survival over the life of his daughter. In many ways, Agamemnon represents the banality of evil that philosopher Hannah Arendt would later describe. He wasn't a monster in the traditional sense. He was just a leader making what he convinced himself was a difficult but necessary decision. He probably told himself that Iphigenia would understand, that she would want him to do what was best for Greece, that her sacrifice was for a greater good. These rationalizations allowed him to do something any decent parent would find impossible. The sacrifice at Aulis became one of the most debated moral dilemmas in Western philosophy and literature. Was Agamemnon a villain or a tragic figure? Was his decision evil or merely terrible? Is there a point where political necessity justifies even the worst personal betrayal? These questions have no easy answers, which is why the story of Iphigenia continues to resonate thousands of years after it was first told. What we can say definitively is this: Agamemnon chose power, glory, and survival over his own child. He lied to his wife and daughter to facilitate a murder. He allowed political calculations to override paternal love. And for that choice, he paid with his own life, his wife's sanity, and his children's innocence. The curse of the house of Atreus, passed down from Tantalus, through Pelops, through Atreus to Agamemnon, finally ended only when there was almost no one left to kill. The winds did blow at Aulis. The ships did sail to Troy. The Greeks did win their war. But the cost was measured in broken families, murdered children, and a dynasty destroyed from within. Agamemnon got his wins. But what did it profit him to gain the world and lose his soul? 5 gods and kings. 5 unthinkable crimes against their own children. 5 stories that have haunted human consciousness for millennia, teaching us uncomfortable truths about power, fear, pride, madness, and the choices we make when pushed to our limits. Cronus devoured 5 of his children alive, imprisoning them in his stomach for years, all to maintain his grip on power. His paranoia turned him into a monster, and his attempt to prevent the prophecy of his overthrow actually guaranteed it. He proved that those who cling too tightly to power will inevitably destroy everything, including their own legacy. Tantalus murdered his son Pelops, butchered the boy's body, cooked his flesh, and served him to the gods to test their omniscience. His arrogance was so profound that he thought himself clever enough to fool divinity, and his pride valued more than his child's life. For this, he earned eternal torment, forever hungry, forever thirsty, forever tantalized by sustenance just beyond reach. Lycaon killed his own son or grandson, prepared the body as a meal, and served it to Zeus to test whether the god was truly divine. His impiety and cruelty earned him transformation into the first werewolf, forever exiled from humanity, forever bearing the mark of his crime in his very flesh. He became the origin of one of our most enduring monster myths, proof that some crimes transform us into something no longer human. Heracles, the greatest hero of Greece, massacred his wife Megara and their 3 sons while gripped by divine madness sent by Hera. Unlike the others, his crime was involuntary, committed while he couldn't distinguish reality from delusion. Yet even this unwilling murder shattered him completely, turning the mightiest warrior into a broken man seeking impossible redemption. His story teaches us that sometimes evil strikes even the best of us, and that good intentions don't always protect us from doing terrible things. Agamemnon sacrificed his daughter Iphigenia on an altar to appease Artemis and gain favorable winds for his military campaign. He made a calculated political decision, weighing his daughter's life against military necessity and his own survival, and chose power over family. His crime was the coldest and most rational, making it perhaps the most disturbing of all. He proved that sometimes the greatest monsters are those who convince themselves their evil serves a greater good. These 5 stories have survived for thousands of years because they tap into our deepest fears and fascinations. We fear losing control as Heracles did. We fear becoming like Cronus, so afraid of losing power that we destroy what we love. We fear the arrogance of Tantalus and Lycaon, the pride that tells us we're above consequence. We fear making Agamemnon's choice, the terrible moment when we must choose between impossible options and live with the results. But these myths serve another purpose too. They're warnings. They show us what happens when fear overwhelms love, when pride exceeds wisdom, when political calculation replaces moral feeling, when madness strikes, when power corrupts absolutely. They're cautionary tales written in blood across the pages of mythology, meant to shock us, disturb us, and ultimately teach us. Which of these 5 stories impacted you the most? Was it Cronus's systematic paranoia, devouring each child as it was born? Tantalus's test of the gods, cooking his son to prove a point? Lycaon's transformation into a werewolf after his crime? Heracles' involuntary massacre of the family he loved? Or Agamemnon's cold calculation, choosing military success over his daughter's life? Drop your answer in the comments below. And if you found these stories as disturbing and fascinating as I did while researching them, make sure you're subscribed to this channel. Hit that notification bell, because we're going to continue exploring the darkest corners of mythology, the stories they don't teach in school, the myths that make us uncomfortable, the ancient tales that reveal uncomfortable truths about human nature. These 5 gods killed their own children, but the lessons of their crimes live on. They remind us that family is sacred, that power corrupts, that arrogance destroys, that madness can strike anyone, and that sometimes the most monstrous acts come from what we convince ourselves is necessity. May we learn from their mistakes. May we never repeat their crimes. And may we never forget that even gods and heroes can become monsters when they lose sight of what truly matters. Thank you for watching. Until next time, remember, the real horror isn't always found in the monsters lurking in darkness. Sometimes it's found in those who should have protected the innocent, should have chosen love over power, should have been better, but weren't.